Spooky friends, gather around. Tonight's meeting isn't just about spells and cauldrons. It's about a very real horror story and one that is scorched into history. And this one begins in a courtroom, but no jury of the peers, no fair trial, and no evidence beyond a nightmare. And yet, in this courtroom, someone will die. Tonight, we are drawing back the curtain on the true story of the witch trials. And trust me, it is far more terrifying than fiction. Today's video is going to come with a bit of a content warning. We're talking about witch trials, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of talk about torture. I'm not going to get into details about what the torture looked like. I'm just going to mention that people were in fact tortured and burned at the stake. If you're sensitive to talking about violence, maybe this isn't the video for you. I have a playlist of lots more, but this video is a little bit darker in nature because it is very difficult to talk about. 3 trials, 3 centuries, 1 pattern. In one story, a servant woman dragged through her snow-covered village, accused of dancing with the devil. In another, a healer, tortured until her bones cracked, and forced to name others or be burned alive. And in another continent, a man pressed between 2 boulders. His final words? More weight. These are not just horror stories. This was the terrifying reality of the witch trials, and how ordinary people, be it your neighbors, widows, or children, became the hunted. But why? Where did this all begin? Before we dive right into the flames, understand this. The term witch meant very different things in different times, but always, it meant someone who was out of place. Just someone easy to blame, a scapegoat. And when the world felt uncertain, when crops failed, when storms raged, or when children died unexpectedly, society wanted something or someone to blame. They needed an answer. So they pointed their fingers and they screamed, witch.
Witch! Witch! Witch!
Let's start with Valais, Switzerland in 1428. This is one of the largest witch trials and one of the first of its size. So long before Salem and centuries before the word Macbeth was even a thought, the witch trials scorched their way through the beautiful Alpine Valley in Switzerland. So it begins in Valais. Keep in mind, this is a politically fragile time. There is no central government and people just have mountains and whispering. In 1428, the townspeople start accusing each other. They would say that their neighbors called demons or conjured a storm, or even worse, they were turning into werewolves at night. And it was then under torture that their fellow villagers would confess to being witches. And what that looked like was flying in chairs, poisoning wells, and causing plagues, allegedly. See, to call someone a witch at this time, you didn't need proof. You just needed 5 people willing to point their fingers at you. And so with that, they started burning people. Over 200 people, and mostly men, were executed, and some reports say 700 people were accused in total. But unfortunately, their deaths were not quick, and what began with them being in shackles ended with them being burned as their screams filled the valley. And these weren't just like secret executions, they were public events. People would go to watch. But the message being sent was simple: obey or face the consequences that you see today. Then in 1590, North Berwick started with their witch trials in Scotland. So picture this, Scotland, late 1500s. The land is very superstitious, very cold, and there's a lot of political ambition everywhere. King James VI, who you will know from the King James Bible that he authorized, he had just wed Anne of Denmark, and they were returning to Scotland together when a major storm raged and almost wiped out the entire royal fleet. But James didn't just blame a terrible time to travel or bad weather. He thought that witches were cursing him. Back in Denmark, women were already being blamed for causing storms, so it made sense to James at the time that that's possibly what was happening. And so James took his fear and he channeled it into witch trials, looking for witches that maybe didn't exist. In North Berwick, over 70 people were arrested, and it was mostly women, as you would expect. They were accused of gathering with midnight covens, dancing with the devil, and conjuring storms. They also were said to have practiced rituals in the graveyards. Agnes Simpson was a very respected midwife and healer, but she was stripped, shaved, and tortured. Eventually, she would confess. She said that a group of witches were plotting to kill the king with wind and water, and under torment, she said something very strange. She started repeating a sentence that the king's wife had said to the king that was impossible for Agnes to hear, so they assumed that the devil was telling her, and that maybe the devil was after him and was using women, witches, to curse him. Another girl, and you might recognize the name, Galis Duncan. She was only a teenager, but because she was beautiful and because she could play the fiddle so well, they thought that she was being coerced by the devil and was a witch. They tortured her with thumbscrews until she would admit that she had made a deal with the devil and that she danced with the devil often. They ripped out her hair, they crushed her feet, and they clad her feet in iron boots. Their confessions, which were forced and public, were printed in pamphlets and distributed across Europe. And the king himself became obsessed with finding witches. He then wrote Demonologie, which was a treatise that then justified the torture, trials, and execution of these women. And in the shadow of this fear, thousands more would follow. Then Salem, 1692. This is the most infamous trial in North America. So in a freezing Massachusetts winter, crops had failed. War was raging nearby, and smallpox started infesting community. In this tiny village of Salem, fear was already permeating the air. And then the fits began. Betty Paris, age 9, and her cousin, Abigail Williams, age 11, began screaming, convulsing, and hiding under furniture. When asked what tormented them, they named 3 women. Sarah Good, who was, for all intents and purposes, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, a defiant widow, and Tituba, a slave brought from Barbados, and she was owned by the Paris family. Now, I will say as a caveat, having done the tours of Salem, it was said that Abigail Williams's family, I believe, had been attacked by indigenous people at the time, which they were on their land, and that she had PTSD from watching her family be murdered. So her convulsing and running into the fire might have been a PTSD reaction, but it's hard to say that that's exactly true. Authorities reported that young Abigail ran into the fire and that they thought she was trying to kill herself, but actually what was happening during this time, there was a ledge inside of the fire that a lot of children were trained to hide in when someone came to their door to attack them because there was no one to protect them. And so maybe Abigail was trying to hide, and because of her PTSD, she froze. Tituba's story is the stuff of nightmares. Some accounts claim that she was doing voodoo and talking to spirits. Obviously, she was beaten into confessing. And I'm not sure why she would confess this, but she said that there was a book with names in it and that she was forced to sign that book. By who? Hard to say. Tituba claimed that she would see black dogs and yellow birds and witches flying through the night. And the court believed her because her words, they fed into the hysteria that they were already feeling, the fear that they already felt palpably. But after that, it exploded and over 200 people were accused of being witches. Girls would fall into fits in the courtrooms, screaming, fainting, convulsing. They were screaming that specters were choking them, and of course spectral evidence was used at this time, never used again after. There were dreams, visions of a shadow woman, but strangely all of that was enough to convict a woman of witchcraft and leading her to her death. Although a lot of people think that Salem witches were burned at the stake, that actually never happened. They were hanged. 19 people would be brought to the gallows, both men and women, but one, poor Giles Corey, he was pressed to death. And when I say pressed to death, they would use 2 pieces of wood on either side of his body and they were placing boulders on top of him. He was pressed to death over the course of 3 days. His body crushed by stone, and the only thing he would say is more weight. There are theories as to why he would say that. A lot of people were saying like he was just trying to prove that he wasn't a witch and he didn't want the stigma on his family. Rebecca Nurse, I actually went to her beautiful house. She was 71 and deaf. A devout woman. She was convicted as a witch and hanged. They imprisoned children and forced them to testify against their parents. The whole thing is just icky. Like, why? Why do this? As a side note, I've done tours in both Scotland and Salem, and I asked, like, why would someone be accused of being a witch? It kind of seems ridiculous. And sometimes the tour guides or historians would say that it was like a land grab, that by getting the person out of the way, that their lands would be forfeited to the people that accused them. There's actually no historical evidence to suggest this, but some say that it did happen in Salem. And Rebecca Nurse would be a really good example of that because she had quite a bit of land at the time. Like, how can you do this to your neighbor? It's just so disgusting to, like, accuse them of something so ridiculous. go through a trial and then watch them hang miserably after being tortured. I don't get it. But it is said, the part that you might not know, is that all of the accused in Salem were landowners, and so under Massachusetts law, the convicted would forfeit their land. Maybe this wasn't fear, maybe this was theft disguised as righteousness. There is a lot of pushback on that, that, you know, Giles Corey, for instance, his land went to his sons, and that material exploitation maybe wasn't a factor, but Sheriff George Corwin collected jail fees by the people of Salem, and they had to pay for their own food to survive, and anyone who was poor, like, they were starving in prison. The whole system was just so gross. It was a mixture of religious ideology that they were hiding behind and economic interest in how can we exploit the system. That wasn't the same specifically for the European trials, but for Salem it was. Eventually the madness turned inward, and the governor's wife suddenly found herself being accused of witchcraft. And in that case, the court suddenly lost their stomach and they couldn't go through with it. So then the trials were halted and the court of Oyer and Terminer were dissolved. Massachusetts suddenly declared the trials to be unlawful. And this is 1592, not too long after the first people were hanged. Interestingly, it took till 2022, a teacher and her students, 333 years after the last witch was put on trial, Elizabeth Johnson Jr. By the way, 20 members of her family had also been put on trial. 333 years later, finally, the last witches were exonerated. They were not guilty of witchcraft. I have no words. But what can we learn from the witch trials? One thing we do know is that they were never about catching witches. They were about control and using fear to control. Silencing those who didn't conform. You poison the narrative, you keep control. The trials didn't happen in vacuum spaces. They happened in many villages, many castles, many cities, and even surrounding churches. And today, witch trials still exist. You see, they still happen, but they're just now in comment sections. They're in the media. They're on X. Sorry, X. They're on the news. They're coming from your government bodies. See, we don't burn people anymore. We don't burn them at the stake. We don't hang them. We cancel them. We shame them. We get them fired. We attack them. But make no mistake, the urge, the fear, the paranoia, they're still the same as hundreds of years before. The witch trials continue because you fear what you don't know, and you don't want to learn more. I have no words. I have so much compassion for anyone who was tried in any witch trial. They happened across Europe. It is said that upwards of 30,000 people lost their lives in Europe during all of the witch trials that occurred, including people who they thought were werewolves and vampires. There has been no definitive proof of a witch ever existing. It's always the healer, it's always the woman, it's always the widow. If I sound frustrated by the witch trials, I am. I don't think anyone should die because you think that they might be a witch. It's all just so ridiculous. So remember, it wasn't spells or magic that killed these witches, it was fear. Magic didn't burn people, rumors did. Politics and greed follow. And I tell these stories not for entertainment. I'm not entertaining you, I'm trying to make sure that no one else burns. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like this video, if you like my deep dive into dark history, please be sure to subscribe and tell your friends. If you like this kind of content and you want some more, visit spookyfriendsclub.com. There's something for everyone there. But be sure to come back because we're always talking about something new and it's not always this dark. In the meantime, spooky friends, stay vigilant out there. And please never forget how a whisper can become a fire. So spooky.